So, in this chamber, we vote by acclamation, which means that if you support the motion, you shout aye. If you oppose the motion, you shout nay. And on the basis of who shouts the loudest, I decide, as objectively as possible, who's won. So, all those in favour of the motion, this house would spray King's orange. Please yell aye. Aye. All those against, yell nay. Nay. Anyone abstaining? I think the nays have it. The nays have it. Thank you so much, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you all for the next emergency debate. Enjoy the main one.
Hello? Is this mic working? Can I ask people to please move up? We've got a lot of people trying to come in. I promise they won't bite. Can we all move up to the ends of the rows and get real close to each other? Thank you so much. Thank you. And
Good evening, everyone. This week, Just Stop Oil hit Kings, and on Tuesday, Greta Thunberg was arrested. It could not be more appropriate, therefore, that tonight we debate the government's response to protest, the motion that this House believes the government is too harsh on protest, and we are honoured to be joined by some distinguished guests. In proposition of the motion tonight, Tim Crosland and Jolyon Morm are joined by student speaker Christopher Lord. And Lady Borwick. As a quick reminder on format, each paper speaker tonight has 10 minutes to make their case. Between each round of paper speakers, there will be a short time for floor speeches in proposition, opposition, and abstention. Should you wish to make one of these, please simply put up your hand when the moment comes and wait for the microphone to come to you. And finally, if you wish to make a POI, please keep it short and polite. Right. If we're glued to our seats, then let's get started. Opening the debate tonight is Tim Crosland. Tim is director of the charity Plan B.Earth. He provided legal representation to small island states at COP21 in Paris and has brought a number of legal actions against the British government for violating its obligations under the Paris Agreement. Tim, it's a pleasure to have you here tonight. The floor is yours.
Good evening. It's good to be here. Thank you for being here. I'm going to talk mainly from the perspective of climate campaigns, which is what I know. The first reason you should vote in support of this motion is the government's crackdown on protest is unprincipled and dangerous. Let's go back to October 2018. The FRAC 33 were jailed. Shocking at the time. It was the first time protesters had been jailed for as long as anyone could remember. Turned out the judge had family links to the fracking industry. The Court of Appeal quashed those prison sentences, and it said we have a long and proud tradition of civil disobedience in this country. It's extremely unusual that anyone would go to prison. We accept there is a low level of culpability for those acting on their conscience. That feels a long time ago. Last year, 50 Just Stop Oil protesters jailed in one day. At a time our prison's so full, judges are being told not to send violent convicts to jail. At a time when Germany is refusing to extradite to Britain because the conditions in our prisons are so dire. Last week, Morgan Trowland, Marcus Decker had their appeal against sentence refused. They climbed the QE2 bridge, suspended a banner, Just Stop Oil, 3 years imprisonment, 2 years, 7 months imprisonment, longer than for a serious sexual offence. Marcus is a German national, but he lives here, his life is here, he's a stepfather to 2 young children. Suella Braverman is applying to deport him to break up his family. Maybe you think that's fair. Let me tell you why it's dangerous. How do people in the movement explain their actions? Well, I'll give you the example of a friend of mine who's about to face jail. Here is the basic proposition she puts before the court. She's got a PhD in microbiology. There is, according to the science, a grave threat to my life, to the lives of my children, to all life, human and more than human. According to the social science, according to political history, non-violent direct action is one of the most effective ways of bringing about transformational social change. I am a mother, and as a mother, I have an inalienable right to take proportionate measures to protect my children. That is how she puts her defence. And whether you agree with her propositions or not, even the courts, even her opponents, know those beliefs are sincerely held. So what happens when you criminalise someone just for doing what they think is necessary to protect those they love? Well, maybe some of them decide this is all getting a bit too much. Maybe. Maybe some decide this isn't a fashionable cause anymore. We'll go elsewhere. But a lot of the people who are deeply committed, they're not going to be any less determined. They're going to be more determined, and so are the people around them. This does not end well. We will not repress people's love for life out of existence. The second reason you should vote for this motion, this crackdown has its roots not in democracy, but in vested corporate interests. Let me make good on that claim, because it's a bold claim. You'll remember the Extinction Rebellion protests of April 2019, those police skateboarding, the pink boat in Oxford Circus with the celebrities. Extinction Rebellion had 3 demands. Admit we're in a state of emergency. Net zero. Proper democracy, citizens' assemblies. Michael Gove met delegates from Extinction Rebellion. Lots of publicity around that. By May 19, 1 month later, Parliament declares a state of emergency. June 19, government commits to a net zero target and a citizens' assembly. Wow, remember the mood then? Public was with those incredibly disruptive protests. But by July of the same year, everything has changed. Extinction Rebellion are the enemies of the people, set on the destruction of our democracy. How did that happen? Big Oil had got worried because they'd seen this was affecting policy. Policy Exchange, we have a representative from Policy Exchange here tonight. I didn't know that until tonight, I should say. Produced a report, Extremism Rebellion. That report said these people are dangerous, they are a threat to our way of life, they are here to break our democracy. That report was everywhere, all over the airwaves, in every newspaper. I remember one of the spokespeople, Rupert Reed, talking to John Humphreys on the Today programme. Rupert asked John, everyone's talking about this report. John, you're a journalist. Do you know where Policy Exchange's funding comes from? John Humphreys said no. Rupert said, well, then you're not a very good journalist, are you? Giving so much airtime to a report and you don't understand its origins. 3 weeks later, Vice magazine had done some digging. Policy Exchange, funded by Big Oil. Got all the information on that from Exxon and others. Hardly any reporting of that. By this point, the framing takes hold across the media and paves the way for deeply repressive police action in October. Protesters held up at gunpoint, people's arms, limbs broken. Rishi Sunak thanks Policy Exchange for having drafted this anti-protest legislation. Reason 3 for you to vote in favour of this motion, this crackdown has now led to a crackdown on jury trial, that most vital of democratic safeguards. And if you doubted the point I was making before about whether this is actually a populist move or not, well, here's a good test. Because what is more democratic, what is more populist than a jury, 12 randomly selected members of the public? Now, if that media presentation was right, if the people are driving this repression, jury trial would be bad, bad news for protesters. It would be guilty, guilty, guilty. That's not what's been happening. It's been the opposite. And not just climate trials, political trials. April 21, the Shell 6, who redecorated Shell HQ, acquitted by a jury. January 22, the Colston 4, you will know about that, acquitted by a jury. November 22, Palestine Action, redecorate Elbit, who manufacture drones that kill Palestinians, acquitted by a jury. January 23, Insulate Britain protesters who blocked the M4, acquitted by a jury. Please.
take when you have been disbarred by the, whatever the legal thing is, when you have yourself been found to have prejudice,
Well,
outcomes of the Supreme Court.
I've got the point. Okay. Thank you for your point. I'll answer it very briefly. In my opinion, the Supreme Court lied about Heathrow expansion being compatible with the state of climate emergency, and it felt important to me to express how I feel about a Supreme Court misleading the public. Those were... And I trust more in the ordinary people of this country than a handful of Oxbridge-educated white males who dominate the Supreme Court. That's where I am. And that pattern goes on. And now what is happening in this country, not in China, not in Russia, is the state is taking measures to prevent that happening again. Judges are telling jurors, there is no defense, you have no job to do here. They are banning people explaining their motivations in court. People have been sent to prison just for using the words climate change and fuel poverty in court. And people have been arrested just holding up a sign that says jurors have a constitutional right to make decisions on their conscience. If you can't believe what you're hearing, please look it up, defendourjuries.org. Not in Russia, not in China, here in the UK. If you're okay with that, vote against this motion. If you believe in democracy, please vote in favour.
Thank you indeed, Tim. We have a slight change from the order papers tonight in the sense that the Lady Victoria Borwick will be speaking first in opposition and opposing the motion. Lady Borwick was the 5th Deputy Mayor of London, serving under Boris Johnson. She has previously served as Chair of the Civil Liberties Panel of the Metropolitan Police Authority and as the Conservative Member of Parliament for Kensington. Lady Borwick, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. I first became interested in this topic after the terrible death of Ian Tomlinson in 2009, following the protests at the G20 summit in central London that year. I believe in the freedom to protest, to complain, to march, and to use all our democratic rights to make our views known. I believe in democracy. And I'm very pleased to live in a country that enables me to disagree with government and express my views. As a woman, I'm relieved not to live in Afghanistan or Tehran or other states that don't respect the freedoms that we enjoy in this country. I come from a generation that's seen a lot of protests, anti-wars, anti-Greenham Common and the nuclear missiles, pro-workers' rights, pro the countryside, pro-trade unions, farmers, civil rights, equal pay, justice. We've lived in trees to stop them being cut down. And of course, pro the environment. Protests are a powerful form of free speech and expression. We have a right to voice our opinions, criticize the government, and advocate for change. Being able to protest gives us the opportunity to publicly express our grievances and our dissenting views and raise controversial issues. But the balance here is our right to protest and make our views known, and the freedom of all citizens to go on about their daily lives. And where do you draw that balance? When I chaired the Civil Liberties Panel following the G20 summit in April 2009 and the death of Ian Tomlinson, an innocent bystander, And I do appreciate this was many of you were at primary school, probably at the time. However, there was a great deal of unhappiness about the police behaviour at the time and how they had responded to the protest. Sound familiar? Going back even further, 1986, the print workers and the police clashed in Wapping with serious violence and many injured and 58 arrested. And in 1990, we had issues with the police use of containment, or kettling as we called it, because we thought it was inhumane. But now it tends to be used to separate, in football matches, to separate opposing sides from attacking each other. So, looking back over the violent protests over the last 20 years. Yes?
This is not what the Public Order Act is saying at all, though. They're trying to regulate protests based on things like excessive noise, which seems to be targeted rather beyond violent protests into peaceful ones.
I would correct you that it's not the Public Order Act, it's the previous one of 2002. Fortunately, everyone blames the police, but they're the ones who come up with a barrage of missiles and direct physical violence. But fortunately, in this country, we don't have tear gas and we don't have water cannon. And for those of you who follow such things, they will know that I voted both at the GLA and Parliament against that, because however bad the situation, water cannon and tear gas are not right in a democratic country. There are over 3,000 public order events annually, and most of these pass without incident. And the Met have become better trained and have become far more skilled in facilitating peaceful protest and de-escalating potentially violent situations. Just as our protests have changed, the way they are policed has changed. So has protest evolved, so has the police response, with far more forward planning and dialogue. Thank goodness. The law surrounding the right to protest is complex. The overriding legislation is the Human Rights Act in 1998, which means that we have fundamental rights enshrined in law. The police are expected to show a degree of tolerance at gatherings, even if individuals within it are committing offences. The police must act within the law and be able to demonstrate that their use of powers are both necessary and proportionate. So recent legislation has seen the Public Order Act of 1986, which codified the common law offences and established powers to manage public processions. Then the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994 established police powers to manage unauthorised encampments and trespass. The Human Rights Act, which we've touched on, Articles 9, 10 and 11, I'm sure those of you who follow these things will be familiar with. And then, of course, more recently, to go back to the legislation by my friend here, the Police, Crime and Sentencing Act and Courts Act of 22 modified police powers in light of some of the Extinction Rebellion protests and others for protracted and longer-lasting assemblies. And now, coming to today, we have the Public Order Act of 2023, where the debate is about the lowering of the threshold for what kind of activity is considered serious disruption. So in the Act, there are a number of new offences, including locking on and tunnelling and the obstruction of major transport works. Although I'm not absolutely sure that locking on is new, after all it was the tactic used by the suffragettes. It's quite right that these new proposals should be tested in the courts, and the police have asked for clarification and codifying of what's acceptable. As the Commissioner of the Police said earlier this month, it's the government who make the legislation, and the police need to know where, as citizens, we want to have that balance. In view of the recent events, the destruction of the Colston statue, where, as you say, they were acquitted, proving that we can demonstrate, disrupting the performance of Les Mis, the Dartford Bridge demonstration, and of course the orange paint sprayed over King's College here earlier this month. I can see plenty of demonstrations. The vast majority of these are peaceful, and there's been no change as to how they are policed. Last weekend, we saw thousands on the pro-Palestine demonstrations. Were the police wearing riot gear and batons? No, they're soft caps. It was all permitted. Demonstrations continue. So in conclusion, I am pleased to live in a country where all these elements are open to discussion and review. I absolutely agree with you. I'm sure, as you saw from the applause, I think we all agree with you. That showed that the police still need more training. I think it was appalling. But the point is that it happened, and they were acquitted. And that is the point. We have the freedom. We have the law here, and we have lawyers here who make sure that, yes, we do have these restrictions. I appreciate, but I've taken these points of order, so I'm trying to do my last paragraph, but I think the point there is Greta Thunberg, as we know, as Mr. President said, was arrested earlier on this week, and the next day she was out protesting again. So I think she and everybody else do have the right to protest, as is evidenced. There were 20-something protesters somewhere in my bag. I have the list of them all.
I put it to you from up here that you are knowingly engaged in reducing civil disobedience to stage dressing. It's a nice thing to bring out the statue of Mrs. Fawcett at the same time as effectively nixing effective protest. And I ask you, what is it you're afraid of?
I'm not afraid of anything, and anybody can go out and demonstrate here. The argument I'm trying to make, and I'm longing to conclude my speech because I've been given the tip-off here, the argument I am making. Go ahead. I think that I'm very pleased the thousands of people demonstrated, and they could walk peacefully through the streets, just as other people demonstrated on the other side. And that's the point of our country. The tragedy over there is ghastly, and man's inhumanity to man is dreadful. But I'm extremely pleased that in this country we can protest about it. May I finish?
It's her time.
Thank you. So, in conclusion, I am pleased to live in a country where these elements are open for discussion and review, because throughout history, protests have played a crucial role in driving social and political change. The new legislation does still protect our human rights, and the Ziegler ruling means that we can protest and we can demonstrate. But the rights of the majority, the rights of those folks going about their daily lives, are just as important. Going to work, getting to appointments, their holiday, the hospital, the funeral, taking children to school. I don't agree with this motion, but before you vote, I just want to remind you that this new legislation also forbids interference with access to abortion services. So before you vote tonight, please think thoughtfully and vote against this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you indeed, Lady Borwick. We're now going to move to a round of floor speeches. So do we have any volunteers to speak in proposition of the motion? Shall we go over here? Name and college, please.
Wolfson College. I would just like to share a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the civil rights movement's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of justice, than to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with your goal you seek, but I can't agree with the methods with which you obtain it. If you agree with the policy or the goals of a movement that is protesting, and yet you disagree based on their methodology, which is essentially growing more and more extreme out of desperation. The climate movement grows more and more extreme each day out of desperation. Oil companies, energy companies, governments are stealing our future for a quick buck. If you disagree based off how extreme their methodology is getting, then you're in the wrong. That's it.
Thank you. Now to opposition. Should we go Barnaby in the middle there? Can we get a mic, please? Yes?
By the way, I'm Samuel from Homerton. And just on that last speech, what about if the cause that you happen to agree with is Palestinian liberation, but the thing that you disagree with is the bombing of Israeli hospitals and schools? Should you then agree with the means because you agree with the goal? I'd just ask you.
I'm desperate to hear the answer now, so should we go back over here?
I think the whole movement or the whole issue of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is like way more nuanced than I can actually give like a real response to in like three. No thanks. This is my time. Just let me get my point across. I would say that I think Hamas, like obviously I do not like.
Thank you, Jason.
I'm not going to like support or like give a moment of like what's the word? I'm not going to like support Hamas, but I think that the act of fighting for freedom, when you are subjugated, first of all, Hamas was elected 18 years ago, half the people in Palestine aren't even 18 years of age. Like, that is a very young population. And my point is that if you subjugate people long enough and you keep them in an open-air prison for long enough and you decry them of basic human rights for long enough, they're going to lash out.
I think we'll go back to the opposition to have one more speech there. Any speeches in opposition? Should we go just here? No. Just here, please. Yeah. No. Order, please. Thank you. A speech in opposition from here. Shh.
You sure there's nobody else? Okay.
A few words, please.
So, as was mentioned just before, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very, very well, important for everything. But the idea that we shouldn't be able to curtail protests or the government is too harsh on protests has ran into a few issues over the last week or so. Genuine and legitimate protests in favour of the rights of Palestinian people have been co-opted to some extent by a certain group of extremists who have held up in London, for example, pictures of Qasem Soleimani, pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini, pictures of whoever the fucking Hamas leader is at the moment. The government is not being too harsh on protests by any stretch. If the government has not been able to arrest the people ruining the legitimate right to protest in favour of the rights of the Palestinian people, by arresting those who have used the Palestinian cause as an excuse to wear their anti-Semitic and their anti-British, anti-Western, anti-human ideologies, by putting up pictures of the men who oppress women in Iran, putting up pictures of the men who oppress women in the Gaza Strip, using Palestine as an excuse. The government cannot possibly be too harsh on protests if there's been no arrests made of those who put up the pictures of Qasem Soleimani and Ayatollah Khomeini. Not when Hamas is considered as a terrorist group in the UK, as per... Look at Fatah, they're completely and utterly horrendous, but they're not terrorists, unlike Hamas.
I do hate Hamas, but I also think that you can't just declare a group to be a terrorist group unless anyone who has any...
Well, what about the people who drove through Golders Green before Israel even responded with the flag of Palestine shouting... your daughters have been raped, your sons are dead.
Ollie, can you conclude? Thank you. Let's move to the abstentions then. Any speeches in abstention? At the back over there. Can we get a mic to him, please?
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I came into this debate under the impression that we were going to be discussing something to do with climate activism, you know, kind of Extinction Rebellion. So I think I'm currently in kind of abstention because I think that the next speakers need to clarify where exactly this debate sits. I also think it's really wrong to kind of conflate what's overwhelmingly largely white middle class, you know, protesting group, kind of, you know, Extinction Rebellion. It is overwhelmingly white and middle class. So, you know, organizations and people like Martin Luther King or the suffragettes, I think conflating these kind of groups that really did struggle and went through kind of severe persecution. No, thank you. Severe persecution. And whilst I do accept that the climate crisis is very real and pressing for all of us, I think it's very unfair on people that have come before us and groups that really did suffer severe persecution and saying, oh, these white middle-class protesters, you know, it's the same thing. It's really not, and I think we should have some clarification from the next speakers on that. Thank you.
Okay, returning to our paper speakers this evening. Speaking second in proposition, we have Christopher Lord. Christopher is a first-year undergraduate of Human, Social and Political Sciences at Christ's College. He won the right to speak through open audition. Christopher, you have the floor.
One second, sorry. I would just like to say I am very thankful to be here tonight. Sorry? I am very thankful to be here tonight. I had no idea that this would happen so early into my first term at Cambridge. I would like to say that I do share one thing with our Prime Minister. You see, this is my first year back in the United Kingdom after living in America for a short while. And this is Rishi Sunak's first year being a British citizen for tax purposes. Now, the Lady Warwick is proud that we don't use tear gas, rubber bullets, and water cannons like our friends in America. And so am I. But as international watchdogs begin to say that we're worse on protests than they are, all I am is worried. The fact of the matter is, my good friend on the proposition has already told you what has happened so far. My mother, who is watching on YouTube right now, hi Mum, says that when she was at the G20 protests, the police were, and this is a quote, nothing but pricks. And it's going to get even worse. Let me establish the status quo, because this government is continuing a long trend of clampdowns on civil liberties. After the last British government was chastised by think tanks and human rights groups alike for clamping down on our right to free speech and expression, a new Tory government decided to do what it does best. Be the same as the last one. Probably the most strong and stable thing about British politics since the words strong and stable were first uttered. First, let's look at the new public order bill that they've attempted to slip under the radar as Liz Truss was ousted, and then finally passed in 2023 earlier this year, because it lets courts hit Britons with serious disruption prevention orders as they see fit, with no convictions needed, and it bans people from attending protests. It includes 24/7 GPS tracking and monitored and restricted internet usage. Again, with no conviction. Ultimately, it means that Amnesty International says that the UK's anti-protest measures go further than even in Russia. That was tacked onto last year's Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act, under which Night Stars volunteers, working with Westminster, were arrested in the dead of night for carrying rape whistles for people who needed them. It was under that legislation that they were then accused of attempting to disrupt the coronation that wasn't even until the next day. It was under that legislation which the Metropolitan Police preemptively arrested Just Stop Oil members, members of the activism group Republic, and a journalist filming them do so. It's under which the police have been granted powers so broad they can shut down any protest as they see fit because the government is intentionally refusing to clarify. And it's under which Greta Thunberg was arrested 2 days ago, as we've heard, not because she was a disruption, but because she could potentially be one. This government has turned to arrests for no crime as official policy. It was just this morning that the co-founders of Just Stop Oil were raided and arrested in their own homes. This is not about anything to do with safety. It is not about anything to do with disruption. At this point, the government's anti-protest measures have grown into nothing but targeted attacks aimed to stifle discussion. Lady Warwick, I would like to say that this government infringes on the freedom of all citizens to live their lives, the freedom that you so proudly claim to defend. One thing is true. There is no situation in which this blatant regard for freedom of speech and free political discourse is justifiable, and yet the Tories continue to attempt to construct narratives to make it seem so. There is no reason that carrying a bike lock or glue in the wrong area should have you subject to arrest. And in pretending it's protecting the people and their rights, this government is stripping away our ordinarily and internationally recognized rights to the freedom of expression and debate. And if our government continues to plug their ears and clamp further down to the ever louder cries for action, not just on climate measures, but in every form of protest, then our futures will not be kind. Future generations will look back on the state of the world and ask us why we did nothing. Future heat waves and cold snaps will be relenting in their wake. And yet this issue expands even larger than just climate. Because this government has been expanding what it attempts to call dangerous acts. You see, the government has mobilized anti-terrorism laws and schemes against their ideological opponents. Now, I know that this is a bold claim, so let me back it up. Because the new Prevent course for teachers says that socialism as an ideology is inherently extremist, that it may lead to terrorism, and that anti-fascist and animal rights groups are inherently dangerous. This is not a government interested in preventing terrorism. This is a government interested in silencing opposition. The idea that socialism leads to terrorism, or that environmental justice concerns are a precursor to terrorist attacks, suddenly means that openly supporting a socialist Labour Party or the Green Party could have youth flagged for being potential risks to the country. But, go ahead.
Is it not that the Labour Party is democratic socialist rather than socialist, and that those two things can actually be taken quite differently?
Do you trust this government to take those things quite differently? So let me tell you why you shouldn't trust this government. Because it's not only not enough for squads to be sent out arresting people for carrying rape whistles, but now Suella Braverman has equivocated the Palestinian flag itself with terrorism. It was just last week that Braverman said that displays of the flag in public may not be legitimate. They may be causes for arrest in and of itself. And in the last 2 weeks, Greater Manchester police have stopped and frisked anti-racism protesters, arrested people for carrying Palestinian flags, threatened the people watching them do so with arrest, and attempted to thwart protests outside of the Tory conference. And it was 2 days ago that a British volunteer doctor in Gaza had his home in the UK, with his family living inside of it, raided for humanitarian volunteering. At what point do we recognize that this is no longer about protecting the people from disruption, but that this is targeted harassment of this government's very opponents? Again, one thing holds very true. This government could not be less interested in preventing terrorism at its source. Because while the number of extremist far-right terror threats continues to increase, this government's focus seems to be on silencing political opposition, on equivocating national origin with support of terrorism, and essentially telling their police that their job is to commit unfathomable attacks on civil freedoms. This government's anti-protest narrative seems to be masked under the veil of protecting safety, when instead the Tories have spent their time in power manufacturing our consent for the violation of our rights. And once again, to respond to Lady Borwick, it is not skillful of the Metropolitan Police, it is not skillful of our government to force citizens through arrest and a trial. And just because the courts shut down this government's attempts at silencing people does not absolve the government from being far too harsh in the first place. Cracking down on protests is not just brutalizing, but these continued attempts at intimidation are far too harsh alone. And they don't come from the Metropolitan Police, they come directly from the government. And it's not just me who's saying this, because there is an international consensus that our rights are being violated. Take it from the Civicus Monitor, which tracks civic freedoms across the world. It's a global research collaboration, according to their website, that tracks fundamental freedoms in 197 countries and territories. In March of this year, it's the downgraded countries for human rights and civil freedoms include Russia, Myanmar, Tunisia, Guatemala, and the United Kingdom. We're now considered an obstructed democracy, with basic civic freedoms being undermined. We're even behind the United States. And again, as someone who lived in the US for 5 years, we're behind the United States. But you know what? There are far more people who are far more sympathetic to this government than I am. Take it from the former private secretary to the Conservative prime ministers, Margaret Thatcher and John Major. Carolyn Slowcock, who said that successive governments of the Tory party had shown a loss of integrity and respect for the law and democratic institutions in August of this year. You know it's bad when the people behind some of the harshest anti-strike laws in British history are condemning you. And that's not to mention how the current generation of Tories seem determined to one-up the Thatcher government in that too. And yet the Tories' response to the international condemnation of their infringement on human rights is to consider proposals to leave the European Commission on Human Rights, because they know their bills and their policies fly in the face of agreed-upon human rights expectations. We know that they know that because that very disclaimer was tacked onto the Public Order Bill itself. And the fact of the matter is, between the weaponization of anti-terrorism laws, an assault on press and personal freedom, a clear disregard for basic human rights, and a refusal to take accountability, this government is far too harsh on protest. And they want to be even harsher. They're trying to restrict the ability for judicial review, making it harder for the legality of their actions to actually be challenged, making it easier for them to act with impunity. They know that they're too harsh on protest. And if this House fails to recognize that this government is, again, far too harsh on protest, we would be not only at odds with the international community, not only at odds with political experts, but at odds with this very government. Please vote in affirmation today. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Christopher. And if any member would like to speak from the dispatch box at the next debate, please do check for email, and details on how to do so are on there. Moving back to the opposition then. Our second speaker in opposition tonight is Poppy Coburn. Poppy is the assistant US opinion editor at The Telegraph and a writer for The Express, Conservative Home and Unheard. Her recent article, Why I Gave Up on Extinction Rebellion, details her opposition to performative anti-capitalism. Poppy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me here tonight. If I could just push back, and it's a slightly pedantic point on the first proposition speaker. We're talking about the funding of policy exchange. Just Stop Oil is also funded by big oil. It's funded by the Getty family. In fact, many of the large environmental protest groups, including Extinction Rebellion, it's the first minute, sorry, but if you wait 30 seconds, I'll get you, are also funded by major fossil fuel heiresses, or heirs, normally heiresses. But anyway, getting back to it, this seems to be quite a hysterical debate for a bunch of people who've basically already won. I mean, really, what more do you want? The government's already passed the Net Zero Act. It's legally binding. It was passed by a Conservative government. It locks us into a certain set of environmental precepts until 2030. Sure, why not?
So, when this government is actively going back on its promises under the Net Zero Act, how can you say that this government is, agreeing with the climate protesters?
Well, I was going to get on with the importance of democracy here, because the vast majority of people in Britain are going to face real consequences for the protests that we find very enjoyable. Sorry, please, I'll get into the flow, and I promise I'll come to you. Thanks. If I'll be frank, if I'd thought that one day I'd be arguing here against an unlimited right to protest, I wouldn't have quite believed you. I was also here at Cambridge University and one of those awful Oxbridge privileged students. My time here at university was centred around direct action and agitation. I was the most self-indulgent middle-class hooligan you could find. I marched up and down King's Parade on behalf of Cambridge Zero Carbon. I cheered on the illegal occupation of Senate House and the vandalisation of university property. I wouldn't dare position myself in the long tradition of meaningful political action in Britain. I was a jumped-up student radical, after all. But I hope that I can provide some insight into the reality of modern direct action protest, who they serve, why it's effective, and how it's separate from a genuine system of civil exchange. Protest is romantic, particularly when the personal stakes are so low and the rhetorical justification for it is so high-minded. So let's tear apart that romanticism. An organised minority always rules over a disorganised minority. Attempts to drive change from the bottom up, in absence of elite organisation, think of the Yellow Vest protests in France, for example, amount to little more than incoherent rabble. The government is perfectly harsh on protests that we all seem to condemn, and by we, I mean outside of the rarefied confines of Cambridge University. I doubt many, if any of the people in the room, will be particularly sympathetic towards anti-vaxxers, or immigration restrictionalists, or Christian anti-abortionalists. If that does describe you, congratulations, you do have the weight of the British state behind you. Don't worry about protesting. There are two forms of protest. The ideal type, that's associated with whitewashed histories of morally acceptable causes. And then there are the unpleasant types, the second, nastier form, those who are, for now, on the wrong side of history, wretched and unfashionable. Contemporary example of this divide could be between movements we saw in 2021. We can look at the racial agitation after the murder of George Floyd, and we can look at the anti-lockdown protests. This is not just a debate over disruption of ordinary people's lives. All protest is disruptive. That is in its very nature. To complain solely of inconvenience is to open oneself up to the obvious rebuttal that some temporary disruption is justified, on the basis that inaction would lead to far greater disruption in the long term. This is the argument made, clumsily, I think, by Just Stop Oil. Now, we may quibble over the details of how supergluing one's hand to a painting speeds up Britain's commitment to a net zero future. But I believe, just as my supervisor once questioned how my inability to hand in an essay because I was marching down King's Parade would help me solve the marketisation of higher education crisis, that slogans like direct action gets the goods and a riot is the language of unheard makes us feel good. Protest in this country is frankly mostly passive and peaceful. It's more resembling a fun day out than an existential struggle for existence. And if the stakes are indeed so low, a little bit of disruption, a few milkshakes thrown over paintings or objectionable politicians, can we really justify introducing new legislation against it? Well, our social system works according to the idea that the state and society are separate, that the state is a neutral body which performs the will of society, and that the will of society is established through non-violent debate. Sure. That's sweet. Well, I mean, I was arrested on behalf of Extinction Rebellion. I'm not actually upper middle class. What I'm trying to say here is... You talked about the Israel-Palestine debate. Do you have any particular connection to this, or is this a proxy?
Point of order. It's not a question.
Sure.
It's not a point of information. You don't have to take it. You don't have to take it.
Sorry, we're going back on Israel-Palestine. I think James is going to talk about that, so I'm going to save this for his one, if that's okay.
A short question, please. A question. No question.
Totally disagree with you, but better get back onto track. So let's go back to the example of the green environmentalist movement. Frankly, it's something I know more about, so I won't try and speak on things I don't understand fully. So look to the example of the green movement. It was the same movement that I was once enthusiastically protesting alongside. And I can think of no greater sign of the hollowness of invocations of preserving civil liberties against supposed government tyranny than this. Many of the actions of a group like Just Stop Oil are intended to disrupt, if not outright terrorise. They're not a protest or free speech. Free speech refers to potentially falsifiable statements intended to persuade a voluntary audience. I cannot argue with someone who sits down in the middle of the road and gets a policeman to arrest me if I disagree. There is no potential for debate here, and hence no utilitarian or other reason to tolerate it. If blockading private citizens is free speech, then throwing manure in my neighbour's garden is also free speech. Environmental activist groups participate in activities which would otherwise be liable for criminal prosecution under the direct protection of the British state. If I do decide to blockade my neighbour's front drive as a private citizen, I can and will be taken to court for it. But Just Stop Oil do this for ideological purposes, and anybody stopping them is arrested for assault by the state. This is why the law had to change from the government. When they stand trial, judges refuse to sentence them, and barristers refuse to prosecute them because they agree with this ideology. Barristers, mind you, like our fellow debater Jolyon Morgan, who was part of a 120-strong group of leading lawyers who declared that they would refuse to prosecute climate protesters. Now, sometimes the law is wrong, and you're right. In your Guardian polemic, I did agree with that. That's true. But by what mechanism should the enforcement of law be changed? Should it be done by Parliament, and the law should be applied the same to everybody, or should it be applied on the basis of the whim of the conscience of a barrister? I shall now quote from Lord Hoffman's opinion about the importance of the right to protest and the unspoken agreement between police and protester. And this was stated between the House of Lords in 2006. I was also in primary school when this was done. Civil disobedience on conscientious grounds has a long and honourable history in this country. But there are conventions which are generally accepted by lawbreakers on one side and law enforcers on the other. The protesters behave with a sense of proportion and do not cause excessive damage or inconvenience. And they vouch the sincerity of their beliefs by accepting the penalties imposed by the law. The police and prosecutors, on the other hand, behave with restraint. By causing never-ending disruption, out of all proportion to the number of protesters, in order to raise awareness of an issue already at the heart of both government and opposition policy, Just Stop Oil has not held up its side of the bargain. And while the police and prosecutors must continue to act with restraint, that may seem to look a lot like spinelessness. Is it the supposed right of an octogenarian pensioner to glue herself to the M25 supreme over the right of the misguided, ignorant commuter driving his car to work? Sorry, I've already taken a few. Do the police have a responsibility to babysit these on fixed incomes determined to break the law? And if so, for how long? How many of you will stand up for the rights of the anti-vaxxers, the immigration restrictionists? Do they have the same protections? AstroTurf consensus is corrosive to political legitimacy. I would argue that Britain is suffering immensely from it. The British state is set up in such a way that those who make policy have no stake in implementing it, and those who implement it have no stake in making it. It is expertly designed to induce learned helplessness and the serial abnegation of responsibility. This is what we call government by stakeholder. Political ideologies work by tapping into popular social forces to force interest-oriented institutions to change. They combine serious policy ideas with catchwords and slogans that appeal to the hopes and fears of ordinary people. All successful protest movements have relied on some degree to elite support to succeed. It is this distinction between those who command this support and those who do not that distinguishes between protests as a genuine last-ditch avenue for the voiceless and those determined to hijack the public sphere for a self-indulgent victory lap. I return back to the beginning. How juvenile it must have seemed to those who were witnessing the 1968 student protest, these jumped-up fools play acting at revolution. But the world today is quite different from that of 1968. Could it now be that our protesters are themselves reactionary? And how many of those radicals, failing to find their promised revolution, downed tools and entered the administrative state? We seem to have entered a new age of protest, one entirely divorced from mass politics. We don't engage with the people. We don't appeal to the masses. Instead, we appeal to nebulous government stakeholders, those who already agree with us, know that we are moral, and know that we are good. I was guided by an unerring belief in the correctness of my own brilliant ideas. After all, I was entirely insulated from consequences of my own actions, coddled both by university administrators and later the British state. And I'm ashamed of my arrogance, my foolishness in thinking that I could impose my half-formed beliefs onto a majority without regard for debate and due process. But then again, I was only 19. I hope the rest of the proposition will too grow out of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Poppy. Before we move to the floor, just a quick reminder that if you wish to make a point of information, it is up to the speaker to accept it, and you should not start speaking until they have. Okay, to the floor. Speeches and proposition, please. Should we go over there? Just Stop Oil.
I managed to catch a speaker in a flat-out contradiction. Second op has claimed on the one hand, we've basically solved climate change in the UK. We've got the net zero targets. We're legally committed to see it through. And on the other hand, that civil disruption doesn't work. Well, might I educate you as to how we got those net zero targets? It was 2019 with Extinction Rebellion locking down London for 7 weeks, blocking 5 bridges. That was how we got those goals. But what it speaks to is a broader bias that parades opposition side. Not taken, you didn't take me. What it speaks to is a broader bias. We like our civil disobedience and protesters in the past, in our history, where we get to thank them for the sacrifice that they made. We don't like them in our present because we have to fail prey to some of the disruption that they cause. But you can bet they will thank you in the near future. And future generations will absolutely thank you. We've also got this bizarre claim that protesters are the self-indulgent ones, not the billionaires in big oil taking extra $100 million bonuses, straight out of taxpayers' pocket, might I add, during the energy crisis. Bear in mind, Liz Truss's government didn't lower energy bills. She gave subsidies to citizens to give directly to big oil. That's why Contractor, one of the biggest big oil energy companies in the world, made $4 billion excess in profits during the energy crisis. It was blind theft from the taxpayers' pockets to big oil. They aren't the self-indulgent ones. Those people taking massive bonuses and cuts are not being self-indulgent. No, it's the protests. It's people standing in roads. And this other bizarre claim that we're a free country because you can protest and get arrested and then sometimes get off. You don't always get off because sometimes these convictions do go through, and it's massively intimidating. You try and convince lots of people in this room to go out and sit on a road for the care of climate change. It's really scary. It's really scary. Genuinely, just while activists are damn terrified of the near future, of the heat waves and disasters that's coming, of mass starvation and mass conflict, and they're only slightly less terrified of the harassment and awful responses they're going to get from sitting on the road. But here's the reality of the situation. The planet's burning. We're going to fly past 1.5 degree warming because of things like Rosebank, these 150 new oil licenses. If your house was on fire and you were asleep, how would you respond to the person who woke you up? Would you say, hey, stop interrupting my nap, I'm sleeping? Dude, you haven't clocked onto your house is on fire, right? I'm sorry, but if you haven't clocked onto the fact that we are going to have in the order of hundreds of millions of refugees come the 2030s, and God knows what by 2040 and 2040, you are asleep as far as the climate change debate is going on. And you need to be woken up.
Thank you. And to the opposition, I see a hand on the balcony. Right, okay. Any opposition speakers? Oh, there's one up there. Oh, there's one down here that's easier. Let's go there.
Thank you. I was just going to talk in abstention, but I think I'm leaning more towards opposition. I was going to start with abstention because I come from Egypt, a country not really well known for freedom of speech or freedom of protest. So to say that the British government is cracking down hard on protesters in the UK is, to me, a little bit of an overstatement, to say the least. That being said, what I've been seeing is a worrying trend that's been actually echoed in these chambers tonight, mainly regarding the Palestinian and Israeli protests. So, like, I know we're going back in circles to maybe something that's irrelevant to this debate, but it really is relevant. I was in one of those protests just this Saturday. Before going to this protest, just because of the doxing that happened to Harvard students with their names and their faces posted on campus, letters from law institutions being rescinded for job offers. Every single one going to those protests, especially if they're of Arab or Muslim background, they had to have had messages circling around saying, hide your faces, don't speak to media, try not to say your names, because you may as well get get arrested. And what's been actually said in these chambers about someone sitting right there, drinking his beer just leisurely, is that, hey, someone extremist might co-opt what you're saying and use it to do something bad. Well, if every single person who might co-opt any movement is a bad thing and in itself a reason to shut down those protests, then no one would protest in the world. Anything could be co-opted by any extremist. Do not ever make that claim. On the contrary, or not on the contrary, kind of like following on from that, saying or repeating boogeyman words such as, if you support something, then you're a terrorist, or hey, they don't have really female freedom of speech, or whatever the hell you want to say, those people have lived for 75 years in open-air prisons. You do not have the right to tell them whether they're bad or good based on whatever morality you've decided for yourself. Whatever you're thinking is pro-Western or pro-idealistic, that is given to you and being fed to you by your government, Habibi. The word terrorist is decided not on the basis of whether or not you're actually a terrorist, is geopolitical strategy. You decide that a group are terrorists because they might pose any strategic or potential disalignment between you and your allies. Many groups have in the past been said that they're terrorists. Nelson Mandela himself was once claimed to be a terrorist and later acquitted when the people finally agreed and finally saw that this is something that was finally super nice to kind of say that there's no appetite. No, sit down. To conclude, yes, we're not really super harsh compared to other countries, relative to other countries. That being said, there is a certain trend that I'm afraid I'm seeing tonight of that going forward, especially in the youth that might one day lead the political climate of the UK. That is deeply concerning, and I do not stand by that. Thanks.
And to abstention. Do we have a speech in abstention? Man with paper there.
Hello, I'm Peter from Trinity. I mean, it's pretty obvious that vandalism is just bad parenting. We don't graffiti historic buildings in England because we have history. And economic damage, it's easy to talk about when you're middle class. And if you don't feel middle class, wait 1 or 2 years until you have a nice city job, then you'll feel middle class. However, the reason why I'm abstaining is because it's not the government's job to set the rhetoric on protest. It's the police's job to enforce the law. And the rhetoric that comes from the Home Secretary is anti-protest. The legislative position in this country is fine as it is. Obstructing a highway is an offence. Vandalising a building is an offence. But just because Just Stop Oil misbehaves, it's very easy to be tempted to backslide on rights. I know it's easy to say, look at Hong Kong. But when we criticise the appalling behaviour of the People's Republic of China, we must lead by example. At the same time, to the Just Stop Oil protesters and those who think orange paint and blocking ambulances is acceptable in our country, my dear friend, yeah. Yes, but if you see the ambulance, you won't see it because there's a long line of traffic running all the way back. My honourable friend, yeah.
There was only one story ever in which it was accused of Just Stop Oil that they had been, obstructing ambulances, and then the ambulance servants themselves came out and said, no, Just Stop Oil didn't block us at all, we got there just fine, right? How can you justify, or how does it make sense to talk about these hypotheticals when we have real-world examples happening right now of this government cracking down on protest?
I'm not disagreeing. You're a brilliant speaker, by the way, but I'm not disagreeing with the fact that cracking down on protest is wrong. But one example is still one example too many. In a democracy, we must accept, in this country, we have rights as individuals. And random facial recognition across our country, we have more CCTV in Britain than China. But in order to have these rights, it is our responsibility to exercise them responsibly. Thank you.
Okay, moving back to our paper speakers tonight then. Shh. Thank you. Our fifth speaker tonight and our last speaker in proposition is Jolyon Maughan. Jolyon is the founder and director of the Good Law Project, a non-profit activist group which aims to achieve change through the law. A barrister, he has taken the UK government to court over Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament, the government's response to COVID-19 and the Brexit process. Jolyon, you have the floor.
I really love points of information. Let me just put that on the record to start with. But I'm only going to take points of information from women. We've heard, virtually from no women at all in this debate. I don't want to start off by bollocking my audience, but come on, guys, we can do better than that. So I'm going to take as many points of information from women as want to ask them. It is, that having been said, really lovely to be here talking about protesting. Semi-reformed, middle-aged tax lawyer wearing a black tie. Pascal famously placed a bet on the existence of God. He said that even if the odds of God existing were infinitesimally small, he would live his life believing. For him, a life in which God did not exist would be a life that was meaningless. Why, you might ask, am I standing here pretending to be somebody who knows anything about French philosophy, and a little bit. I thought that would be the vibe. But also, more importantly, we all of us, particularly those who are at the start of their adult lives, we have to make a choice. We have to make a choice about how we're going to live. And if you want to be cynical about it, all participation in democratic life is pointless, is to be sneered at, is performative, if you like. The fact is, you could live 1,000 lives voting in every general election and never once get to say, but for my vote, the government would be different. So at that really base, cynical level, democratic participation is pointless. And what's true of voting is also true of every other type of democratic engagement, including choosing to speak about politics and choosing to listen to politics, doing exactly what we are doing at this very moment in this brief interregnum between drinking is a performative act. And that's true of the right to protest as well. But we don't protect it because we know it will make a difference. We protect it because we feel a need to respond to a world that seems to us to be in crisis. Because we have to believe that our actions matter, that our lives matter. We have no choice. There is no other way to live our lives. It is what participation in a democracy looks like. Democracy isn't a periodic event. It's not like a wedding anniversary that you do, if you remember, once a year and then you forget about. It's participatory. Every day, as Cole Porter sang, was Valentine's Day. And it's an act of love and an act of faith. And by protecting the right to protest, we are choosing to protect the right to participate in, to believe in democracy. And what is articulated in the act of legislating against protest is a desire that we not participate, or that we participate less in the democratic life of our nation, in our futures. This is the 1985 white paper of the then government, which, as you will all know, was a Conservative government. Rights of peaceful protest and assembly are amongst our fundamental freedoms. They are numbered amongst the touchstones which distinguish a free society from a totalitarian one. And I watched my friends on the opposite bench clapping at the proposition that things here are not as bad as Egypt, a country where opponents of the government are imprisoned without trial, are tortured, are murdered. I have higher aspirations for the United Kingdom, for my country, and so should you. Things are bad here. They are bad here. That's right. There's not really I don't sense a question in my immediate future. But also, I agree with your essential point. The right to protest is the right to protest against power.
Sorry. It's Julian's time.
I'm deferring to the chair, if I may. Christopher, things are bad. Things are bad. Christopher told you about Just Stop Oil protesters being arrested this morning. And coincidentally, on the bus on the way here this afternoon, I bumped into Roger Hallam. Roger told me about being arrested in his home at 6 o'clock yesterday morning. His 34th arrest, he said, with a note of pride, it is fair to say. And he was arrested at 6 o'clock in the morning for a speech that he had delivered at a festival in August. That is not the application of the law to serve any legitimate end. It is the application of the law as an act of harassment, of state-sponsored harassment against its political opponents. There is no other way to read that act of arrest of Roger. And indeed, that is true of the other Just Stop Oil protesters as well. Let us look at how the law now stands. Victoria gave you a long and glorious example of protests that we had permitted over the decades. But the proposition is that the government is too harsh on protest today, from whence comes these brutal turns of the ratchet. The police can, in consequence of changes in the law made in the last couple of years, criminalise people on a march or a protest if it causes a hindrance that is more than minor. A hindrance that is more than minor is enough to criminalise a march. And in working out whether it is more than minor, police can take into account disruption from unconnected protests in the same area, including by different people on different days. So X causes a minor delay on day 1, and unconnected Y causes a minor delay on day 2, and the police say the cumulative effect of those two acts is more than minor, and the march is criminalised, and the marches, if they continue, are criminalised. Second example, if you do something that you intend to create a risk of serious annoyance to a section of the public, you can go to prison for 10 years. For 10 years. Causing serious annoyance should not be a criminal offence at all. I say this as a man... I say this as a man who causes serious offence most days. But creating a risk of serious annoyance, punishable by 10 years? Really? You may say, and many do, well, be real, no one takes these offences at face value. And perhaps that's right today, although taking offences at face value is fundamentally the definition of being a lawyer. They are there on the law books, these offences, ready for a government to wield them as weapons against its people. And they are vague, which means they will have a chilling effect. If you can't afford a conviction, you won't do some things that are legal because you cannot know that they are legal. They will have a chilling effect, especially for those for whom the consequences are especially severe, whose citizenship of the United Kingdom is now conditional following changes made under the Nationality and Borders Act. Let me be clear who I mean by this. I mean the anti-protest laws will have a chilling effect on black people and brown people. And that's an important point. That's a really important point, because the people whose participation in the democratic life of our nation, whose participation will be impeded, it isn't me. And with respect to my friend Victoria, who spoke very, very well, it isn't her either, and it isn't Poppy. The police will look at us, they will see our privilege, they will hear our vows, and they will know they are taking on someone who can instruct lawyers, who will be believed by juries, and they will go and pick on lower hanging fruit. They will pick on working class people, and we have seen them do it. They will pick on black people, they will pick on brown people, they will pick on those whose place in society is not as secure as mine is. It will be those who lack social capital. Let me return to Pascal. Other choices are available, but my choice is to live my life believing, to believe in democracy, to believe in protest, to believe in it having value. I can know that unless we strain every sinew against the things that we know are destroying society, destroying the planet, we will lose. I can know that we will lose unless we resist the forces of capitalism that are destroying the planet beyond any shadow of evidential doubt. I think it's an important endeavour. It's a good way for us to choose to live our lives, a necessary act of faith if we are to believe in democracy, and it ought to be safeguarded. Perhaps for some of us, the stakes are not so high, but they are if you live in the global south. People are dying now, not hypothetically if ambulances are hypothetically blocked by protest. People are actually dying now, and they are dying in their tens of thousands in Pakistan. In the global south, climate change is not some hypothetical future. It is a present, lived, or dying reality. We must stop it by any means necessary, because the alternative is that we will die not in our tens of thousands, not in our millions, but in our billions.
Thank you, Julian. Moving to our final speaker this evening, James Vitale. James is the head of political economy at Policy Exchange, the UK's leading think tank. A recent graduate of Christ's College, he served as president of our union while studying for his PhD in politics. James, you have the ears of the House.
Mr. President, thank you very much for having me back, and what an appropriate place to be discussing this motion this evening. I've been told plenty of stories from ex-presidents myself about protests here throughout this union's history, from Julian Assange to Marine Le Pen. Actually, in my term, and this is about a union member who's in the audience tonight, so I won't mention his name, but there was an event that I held with a very large protest just out there, very noisy, very high security, very stressful for me. And I made my way to the bar after the event, and I saw this member. I thought, oh, I'll go talk to him about how it went. And I went up to him and said, oh, what did you think of it? And he said, don't know, boss, I was at the protest. I also want to congratulate Christopher on his first speech tonight. He's from Christ's College, which was where I was at. He did a very good job. In wrapping up, usually I'm meant to sort of summarise the speeches that have been made this evening, very good as they were. But I'm going to take a bit of a liberty, and I'm going to make my own case this evening. And I'm going to try and put to you the hardest case I think we could possibly discuss this topic of protest on. And I'm going to do my best to toe a very fine, very nuanced line. I think this debate can very often be quite philosophical, quite abstract, so I'm going to start with an anecdote and then some facts, and then maybe I'll engage with the philosophical question afterwards. This summer, I took a trip. I visited this rural community. It was idyllic. It was a beautiful summer's day. There was children playing in the sort of lush green spaces. There was a school in the middle of it. It was quite a child-orientated community. It was quite peaceful. It was the sort of place you would think any parent would want to raise their children. The name of that community was Kfar Aza, which for those of you who don't know, I imagine there are few, it is a kibbutz in the south of Israel. On the 7th of October, Hamas terrorists breached the Israeli security perimeter. They entered the kibbutz and they killed in excess of 100 people. Some more facts. Women, children and elderly were executed. Some were burned, some were beheaded. More widely, 1,500 Israelis have been murdered since that weekend in the worst mass killings of Jews since the Holocaust. Hostages were seized, and some of those were UK citizens. Some more facts. Since the 7th of October, some 3,700 people have been killed in Gaza, many civilians. The situation unfolding in Gaza is a humanitarian crisis of the most severe proportions. When it comes to our own country, the government and the opposition have been very, very robust and very consistent. They stated their support for the State of Israel to guarantee the security of its citizens. It sent 2 warships to join the American carrier out in the Middle East to try to deter basically an expansion of the conflagration. And it has stated in no uncertain terms that how Israel responds matters. They have to act in accordance with international humanitarian law, and when they don't, I expect our government to hold them to account. And the Prime Minister has also tripled the aid going to the Gaza Strip. A final few facts just at this stage. In the last fortnight, tens of thousands of people have taken part in demonstrations up and down our country and across the world. Most of them have been protesting the acts of the State of Israel in response to the attacks a fortnight ago. Most attendees have been peaceful and the best-intentioned people. But not everyone. Some have not. Some are celebrating the activities of Hamas and glorifying in their terrorism. At least 2 people carried placards of paragliders, a homage to those terrorists who entered Israel by that means on the 7th and proceeded to murder dancers at a festival. Some sing "From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free," which expresses a desire to wipe Israel from the map. The Evening Standard has reported on graffiti in the City of London, which depicts Hitler making a salute with the words "Jews" scrawled next to it. Red paint was thrown over 2 Jewish schools in North London. Last week, in response to these protests, 3 Jewish schools closed, and the Menorah High School for Girls cited safety concerns for their pupils because of those demonstrations. Scotland Yard has said that anti-Semitic attacks have increased by 700% on the same week last year. Let's return to the question this evening. Are we too harsh on protest? Now, I think the proposition have made some really, really good speeches this evening. Very persuasive, very powerful. But one of the things I don't recognise in what they've said is their characterisation of the UK. We cannot seriously be protesting the principle of protest in the United Kingdom, or whether it's under threat. This is a country of protest. It's deeply hardwired into our national story, from the suffragettes to the anti-abolitionists. Let's just take the last 20 years to name a few. We've had enormous public protests about Iraq, about climate change. We have protesters here this evening, and the use of oil. We've had protests about the monarchy, about doctors' pay. We have effectively a permanent Brexit protester in Stephen Bray outside of Parliament. We've protested the banning of dog breeds. And let me say also, we've had thousands of protests here, and not just this year, but in many years, about the acts of the Israeli government. So this isn't about the principle of protest, this debate. This debate is about degree, it's about balance, and it's about extent and trade-offs. And I submit to you that far from being too harsh on protest, I think we have currently I think we have the opposite problem. That our leniency in some certain cases, however well-intentioned, is impinging on the vital and basic rights of others that Chris spoke plenty about this evening. The right of protest is not absolute, and that's perhaps amazing to hear potentially coming from a former president of the Cambridge Union, but I think this is rather like freedom of speech. We aim to push free speech very far in a place like this, and we can and we should. But those rights are not unlimited. Context matters. And I want to read a quote from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty to you, which is perhaps the best systematic treatise of liberalism. And he said, "Even opinions lose their immunity when circumstances in which they are expressed are such as to constitute their expression a positive instigation to some mischievous act. An opinion, for example, that corn dealers are starvers of the poor, or that private property is robbery, ought to be unmolested when simply circulating through the press, but may justly incur punishment when delivered orally to an excited crowd assembled before the house of a corn dealer, or when handed about among the same crowd in the form of a placard. Acts of whatever kind, which, without justifiable cause, do harm to others, may be, and in the more important cases, absolutely required to be, controlled by the unfavourable sentiments and, when needful, by the active interference of mankind. The liberty of the individual must thus far be limited. From one of the greatest liberal thinkers history has ever seen. Mill's principle applies to protest too. As I said, Christopher spoke a lot about the rights of life and liberty and them being violated. My right to protest should never compromise your right to life and to liberty. To facts once more. There are plenty of examples we've discussed this evening, but I really want to hone in on the protests of the last 2 weeks over what's going on in the Middle East. In a democratic society, it is right that we defend the right to protest the policies of both our own government and governments from around the world. But it is another thing, completely and entirely, to allow individuals to attend such events and spread hate and incite violence. For it is a fact that Jewish communities in our own country have stopped sending their children to school, they've stopped wearing kippahs in public, and they've been afraid to go outside. And it is explicitly because of the protests that have happened recently. Yes, please.
Is this not because of deeply rooted anti-Semitism? This isn't because of protests. I would not describe attacking Jewish schools and drawing swastikas on them as protest. That's not protest. That's just anti-Semitism. And now that's 2,000 years old. Yeah.
You can't POI a POI. Just no.
I'll respond to that, shall I? I think you want to repeat here.
Yes. Well, I walked past my own primary school. This is way before this. This is about a year and a half ago.
Will you let me, is that right? Thank you.
That's not protest. That's just anti-Semitism.
I think that's a subject of debate. We can decide where we draw the lines, but I just refer to the statement I mentioned at the start about the Menorah High School, explicitly about the protests that happened in central London. The idea that those things that I've just described for our Jewish community can happen is utterly unacceptable. We are a tolerant, liberal, democratic society. That is intolerable. And be in no doubt, it would be intolerable if we were talking about the Muslim community in our country or the Arab community in our country. I don't want to advocate stopping peaceful protests. In fact, last night I walked through Westminster past a peaceful vigil for victims in Gaza. But what I do want, just a moment, what I do want is to be robust on people inciting violence and hate. Yes, please.
Just that you don't want to advocate the stopping peaceful protest. There's a very eminent, respected US journalist, Amy Westervelt. You might have seen something she's written recently. The headline was, "The Shadowy Network Demonizing Climate Protest Around the World." She talked about this network of think tanks, the Atlas Network, and she said, in Britain, there's an organization called Policy Exchange, which is part of the Atlas Network. Do you deny what she says in that? And if so, does Policy Exchange have any plans to sue her for libel?
I listened to your speech very closely. I'm not here to have a policy debate about organisations and what they talk about when it comes to protests. I'm here to make a moral case. And if you don't mind, that's what I'm going to continue doing. A free, liberal society is not self-sustaining. Its perimeters need vigilant defence, and it needs defending against people that glorify pogroms, because doing that undermines our liberal society. It offends against our most basic sense of decency. To recapitulate, the way we are currently approaching protests has left one of our country's minorities afraid and unable to go about their everyday lives. And it's not because of those people protesting peacefully, as I just said. It's because a minority of those people at those demonstrations have celebrated the death and suffering of Jews. And protecting the rights of those Jews, and this is the critical point, it must come before the rights of others to say whatever hateful things they have in their head. It must do. I want to finish with another quote and a final point, if I may. The quote comes from Isaiah Berlin, who's arguably one of the most famous liberal thinkers of the 20th century, but importantly too, he was a Jew. And he said this about liberty, just after the Second World War. "I do not wish to say that individual freedom is, even in the most liberal societies, the sole or even the dominant criterion of social action. We compel children to be educated,
and we forbid public executions. These are certainly curbs to freedom. We justify them on the grounds that ignorance or barbarian upbringing or cruel pleasures and excitements are worse for us than the amount of restraint needed to repress them. This judgment depends in turn on how we determine good and evil, that is to say our moral, religious, intellectual, economic and aesthetic values. The extent of a man's or a people's liberty to choose to live as he or they desire must be weighed against the claims of many other values, of which equality or justice or happiness or security or public order are perhaps the most obvious examples. For this reason, it cannot be unlimited. Let me conclude. I've spent much of this evening talking about context and the importance of it. But we must not allow attention to context to grip us with a moral relativism, a view that says, well, things are complex, things are complicated, so we can never say anything about what is right and wrong. I think when things are complicated and complex and difficult to navigate, we need to find those things that we can hold on to together, that give us certainty and help us tackle the moral obstacle course. So let me try to finish by offering some clarity. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not too harsh on protest in the UK. And it is wrong to be so lenient on protest that individuals, in the immediate aftermath of a terrorist atrocity, the worst we have seen since 9/11, are able to celebrate the death of Jews and call for the further killing of Jewish people. It would be wrong if it were individuals celebrating the deaths of any other ethnic minority. Allowing this to happen is not a success of our liberal society, it is an abject failure and a threat to it. And we must be determined in opposing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. And that concludes our debate for tonight. But before we vote, I just have one quick notice. As some of you know, the Hawking Fellowship was established in 2017 with Stephen Hawking to provide a platform for figures that have made a historic contribution to the STEM fields. As such, I'm incredibly pleased to announce tonight that the fellowship this year has been awarded to OpenAI, the creators of the AI models ChatGPT and DALL-E. And so Sam Altman, the co-founder and CEO, will be in this chamber on the evening of the 1st of November to discuss and debate with us. Please keep your eyes out tomorrow for the formal announcement. So as you know, in this House, we vote with our feet. Once your vote is cemented in, eyes to the right and nose to the left, with abstentions down the middle. Thank you very much for coming this evening. Thank you to all our speakers, and good night.